Hello, I'm Bobby Gillespie. I'm going to read you an excerpt from my book, Tenement Kid. This is chapter 11, The Sash My Granny Wore at the Acid Factory. In the summer of 1984, the Reeds, Douglas and I and a few others decided to take an acid trip together. We went up to East Kilbride where they used to trip at this place they called the Acid Factory. It was an abandoned post-industrial wasteland. The Mary Chain would go into this abandoned factory, listen to music and take photographs. It looked post-apocalyptic, like something from The Omega Man, starring Charlton Heston. Really cool. Jim, William, Douglas, myself and Beatty met at the factory one Saturday afternoon in mid-July, the 12th as it happened. We took another couple of mates with us, one called Paul Hart and another mate of his from Castlemilk called Big Paul. He eventually formed the band The Submarines, who opened for us at Splash One a year later. Paul Hart was a close friend of mine, and we used to listen to Cabaret Voltaire's Sensoria Crackdown album and a bit of Psychic TV and watch those Double Vision Ralph Records VHS compilation videos together up at his flat. He was into post-punk industrial stuff, Pistols and Public Image Limited. On this occasion, the two Pauls didn't take any acid, only Beatty, myself and the three Chain Boys. I remember telling McGee about our psychedelic date over the phone a few days beforehand. I said, the Scream and the Mary Chain were going to take acid together this Saturday. McGee said, it's a meeting of minds. It's going to be legendary. The trip began well and there was some deep soul bonding going on between us and the Mary Chain. They had a cassette player with them which played compilation tapes they had made especially for the trip. I remember I Want to Be Your Dog playing as Jim Reed smashed a metal pipe he'd found into a concrete wall, making a beautiful percussive sound. I wished I could have recorded that moment on audio tape. I still have it in my visual memory, like Neubatten meets Yoruba, the sound of primitive violence meets industrial ritual. Caveman by the Cramps was playing as I sat on my haunches on the burning ground as the sun beat down on us. I picked up stumps of 2 tree branches and beat them in time to the Cramps' primitive modernist rock and roll classic. I seemed to regress backwards through time and I felt myself undergoing a transformation through millions of years of anthropological civilizational development, returning to my true primitive state until I became the caveman in the song. Each beat of my tree branch drumsticks reverberated in bluish purple sound and images became noise. I could hear the colours as well as see them. This was some powerful motherfucking acid. My outwards and inwards vision was synced in perfect time with the rhythm. I felt godlike. But the god delusion wore off, and soon I had visions of millions of locusts everywhere. Everywhere I looked, the greeny brown texture of the grass had turned into locusts. We were outside East Kilbride in the Scottish countryside. The acid factory was surrounded by farmers' fields and a wood. There was green grass everywhere, and somehow in my warped, paranoid, and fast-melting, acid-zapped mind, I told myself that if I stood on a tree stump or a stone, I was safe from the locusts. I wouldn't move from the tree stump because everywhere the grass looked like locusts to me, and I was so gone on the acid that I couldn't speak. I was imprisoned in my own self-made private hell. By this time, Jim and William had gone off together somewhere. I later found out that William had been having a bad trip as well and was freaking out because he had hallucinated spiders crawling into his brain via his eyes. He had that long curly fringe hanging over his eyes and imagined it was spiders intent on eating his brains. Real horror movie stuff. The two Pauls, not on acid, were saying, let's go, let's get out of these woods. I was saying, I ain't fucking moving, I ain't fucking moving. None of them could see what I was saying. Later on, I would write the lyrics for the song Burning Wheel, which describes the self-induced paranoid psychosis I'd wrought in myself through my years of chemical experimentation. This was the beginning of all that. After the trip, I discovered that during my freakout, I had taken all of my clothes off and clambered on Douglas' heart. He didn't know how to push me off. He was so terrified. Tripping out, he just lay there. He later told me that the longer I lay on top of him out there in the woods, the more he felt like he was being slowly reduced to a piece of cardboard, getting thinner and thinner and thinner and thinner, with me on top of him like a naked corpse. He was nervously mumbling, "Bobby, Bobby, Bobby, please get off me." Douglas also told me that while we were in the woods, tripping, he heard the sound of gunshots hitting the trees and saw a local Ned firing an air rifle in our direction. Doug walked over to where the rifle-toting Ned was standing to tell him that I was on acid and having a freak out and to please not aim in our direction. Mr. Trigger Happy thankfully acquiesced to Doug's plea. I have a near complete blackout about these two episodes, something that would reoccur again and again in my future drug and drinking career. I also have a blackout regarding running out into the middle of the country road naked to attack moving cars, though I'm told it happened. When I eventually got home that night and looked in the mirror, I could see that my face and hair were smeared and matted, covered in filth and dirt from the hard, dry ground in the countryside. I had been rolling about in the fucking dirt in the forest all day, naked. My friends later told me that he'd had to dress me. Once the acid had begun to wear off and some of my rational senses had returned, we left the woods and started to walk back towards the town centre of East Kilbride so that Jim, myself, and the two Pauls could get the bus back to Glasgow and the sanity of civilization. As we walked up the never-ending steep hills around East Kilbride under an unforgiving hot sun, I was sweating buckets. But the nightmare wasn't over yet. Walking up towards the town, I saw some buildings. They were 5 stories high at most, these flats, and I was walking up this fucking endless hill, puffing and panting and sweating on the hottest day of the year so far. I could just see the buildings expanding and contracting in time with my breathing. I breathed in, they contracted inwards. I breathed out, they expanded outwards. And I kept thinking that the roofs on this council estate were all gonna explode at any moment and blow right off. When the roofs blow off the houses, then the top of my skull would too, and my brains were gonna come flying out just like the inhabitants of the flats and all their furniture and belongings. My heart was beating fast and hard, pounding with existential fear, echoing boom, boom, boom in my brain as I walked up the hill to my personal Golgotha. I felt dirty and guilty and told myself I deserved to feel like this, that I only had myself to blame for my psychedelic sins. Only a fool would mess with this demonic stuff. It was the devil's own poison. Only seasoned trippers could navigate the treacherous psychotropic oceans onto which each mysterious journey into the uncharted territories of deep mind and soul exploration that was an acid trip could take you. I was ashamed to admit that I was just an amateur, a weekend sailor who had crashed on the rocks and was now cognizant enough that within a few minutes' time I would witness the true price of my folly. I heard the sound of a martial drumbeat echoing around my frazzled skull. What the fuck is that? I thought. Then I stopped walking and turned around. Through the heat haze of the late afternoon and my skewed, goggle-eyed acid vision, I saw the sight of an orange pipe and drum band marching slowly up the road towards where us acid stragglers were stood on the pavement. I swear that the pipe band and lodge members morphed into an enormous creature resembling a huge orange slug, leaving a trail of greasy orange slime behind them. They had set off from East Kilbride earlier that morning and marched into Glasgow playing their triumphalist Protestant battle songs, all instrumental on flute with drum and accordion accompaniment. I knew all the words to these songs. I had grown up with them. The Orange Order had gathered yearly in Palermo Street every 12th July to commemorate King Billy's victory over the armies of the Catholic King James at the Battle of the Boyne in 1690. You couldn't escape that date. It was spray painted on walls all over Glasgow, denim jackets and school desks. Some head cases had it tattooed on their arms as well, in a rough homemade prison style. As an innocent child, I had watched the band leader throw his mace in the air, topped with a heavy, imperious, gleaming silver headstock. The length of the mace was covered in red, white and blue ribbons. I'd made my own version out of an old mop handle, painted silver and festooned in garlands. All the boys on my street did it, and we would have competitions to see who could throw their stick the highest and catch it before it hit the ground. I was good at this game. We copied the way the band leader moved the mace from side to side, over his back and round his neck, before throwing it high in the air again to the cheers of the marchers and camp followers. The pipe bands and their leaders looked glamorous and exciting to a 7-year-old with no idea of the sectarian bigotry that the Orange March represented. To us, the band looked just like the soldiers we saw in medieval or Napoleonic era action adventure movies, minus the armour and horses. By 6 o'clock, the Orange Band and their followers had endured a day of seriously heavy drinking. Once the speeches had been made by the high-ranking lodge leaders in Glasgow Green, camp followers and band members would get seriously tanked up for the long journey home to whatever part of Glasgow or Lanarkshire they came from. As the big orange slug crawled past us at funereal speed, my eyes fixed on the fat, sweaty faces of the pipe band musicians. Up close, they all had bright red faces from being exposed to the sun all day without wearing sun cream. Their burnt faces were exaggerated on the acid. Their Hiroshima-like faces melted in the summer heat. I had no cause to fear the orange men and women because I was no threat to them, merely watching their final ascent back to their hometown. They didn't even notice me, Beatty and the two Pauls. They'd had a long day and so had we. I remember thinking whilst watching them march that I had got what I deserved. My psychic crucifixion was complete.